will you start by introducing yourself?
I'm Anthony Davies. I'm Associate Professor of Economics at Duquesne University and the Milton Friedman Distinguished Fellow at the Foundation for Economic Education.
James Harrigan. I am the co-host with Anthony of Words and Numbers, a podcast you should check out. I am also the senior editor at the American Institute for Economic Research.
Yeah, I just told the listeners in Danish that Words and Numbers is my favorite podcast. And you also, first of all, because you're interesting, you have a lot of interesting views on politics and economy, and also because I learn a lot about the United States. And that's the reason I invited you to participate in Retsstaten today, or the regulatory state. Because I read an article, and I mailed it to you in English, but basically the article said that that there is no principle of subsidiarity in the European Union. So there is no way that the member states can go to the EU Commission and say that this is none of your business. You can't make these rules because that is up to the single member states. And I've heard you talk a little about that, about the federal government in the United States, and thought that it would be interesting because the United States is far ahead of the European Commission in having a history as a federal society. So I'll reach out to you to talk a little about this. And but before we start, maybe you could explain to me and the listeners what is the principle of subsidiarity? Is that what you called in English?
Yes, subsidiarity. It's an interesting because in the United States, it's predominantly the political left that will use this term subsidiarity. There's a similar term, or I should say similar, it means the same thing, roughly speaking, on the political right, and that's federalism. But I don't think the two sides are aware that they're, in many cases, talking about the same thing. But what it boils down to is governing at the lowest possible level. So if there's a situation that the local government can handle, the state government should not. The state government should only handle those issues that the local governments are incapable of handling. And similarly, the federal government should only handle those issues that the state governments are incapable of handling, which ends up being, in a lot of ways, the opposite way that we tend to govern in the United States. People see a problem and they run to Washington and they look for a solution that's going to apply to everybody, which is the opposite of subsidiarity.
I would say that both the left and the right, for all kinds of reasons, have gotten away from any idea of federalism. I prefer to use the term federalism for whatever reason. Maybe it's because I'm on the political right in Anthony's terminology. But both sides seem to be of a mind that if they can get Washington interested in what they're doing, they can win once and for all, and they never have to worry about it again. And I think this is the legacy of Roe versus Wade, the abortion case that the Supreme Court heard back in the early 1970s. The Supreme Court had no business ruling on that. That was properly understood to be a state issue through the 10th Amendment. Right? And when the Supreme Court butted into that issue and ruled in such a sweeping way, both the left and the right looked at it and said, okay, that's the way we're going to do everything from now on. And since about 1973, 74, that's largely been the case.
Yeah, let's come back to that a little later. Sorry, there was a baby alarm here. But before we move on to the experiences from the United States, can you talk a little about why is this a sound principle? Like why is it a good way to run a country, basically?
It's a sound principle precisely because we're all different. And I give you the age of COVID as an example. And President Trump received a lot of flack from people saying that, well, there was no federal response to COVID. And whether he intended it this way or not, I cannot say. But the effect of him as leading the federal government, the effect of him stepping back was to allow the states to handle COVID in their various ways. So, for example, it was much less of a problem in Wisconsin than it was in New York State, and much more of a problem in New York City than it was throughout the rest of New York State. And because of that, different approaches to the problem were necessary. What worked in Wisconsin would not have worked in New York State in general. What worked in New York City would not have worked in upstate New York. And to ask for a federal response is to ask for necessarily pretty much one solution imposed on everybody, rather than particular solutions tailored to particular needs. So to the extent that you have a population that's diverse, that has different constraints, faces different opportunities, you want solutions that are tailored specifically to different parts of the country. And that's subsidiarity.
I think this is really important in a way that most people tend not to think of it. The United States geographically is huge, and the different regions share almost nothing with each other. So I'm in the desert West. I grew up in New England, which is way on the East Coast. These are functionally different places. There's really not a lot that unites them. And when you start talking about these large, sweeping, more or less, it's almost always legislation, right? That kind of blankets the entire country. We're far better off if we understand that, look, these are different places with different priorities, different geographic realities. Where I am now, I share more with Mexico than I do with New England. And when I was in New England, I shared more with Canada than I did here. And you start realizing just how radically different the regions of the United States are. And one size rarely fits all. It's almost never that's the right answer.
But so do you agree that for me the principle goes basically all the way down to the individual? So there are some things that that I would say that this is my business and I know what is best for me, and nobody else should regulate what I do here. And then there's some things that we do in the family, that we make decisions on in the family. And then some things again that we do in the neighborhood, and then the municipality and local government, and in the end the Danish government, and EU, and maybe even the United Nations.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And if it's done correctly, what you'll see naturally is that the bulk of the decisions are being made at the lower levels, and very few will be made at the high level. We've never had evolve a world government. You have the United Nations as a deliberative body, but it's not really a governing body. And I think in part that's due to the fact that there really aren't many problems. You might hold out global climate change as an exception, but generally speaking, there aren't many problems that rise to the level of requiring a world government. And so I think in part that's why you tend not to see one evolving.
And you started exactly where I think we all should. The inviolability of the individual, right? The individual stands astride the state, and there are very few reasons the state should ever butt into his life. And it has to be, I think, very, very important. We begin, and I think almost everybody who believes in any sort of individualism or indeed any kind of revolutionary thought, we begin with the idea that all men are created equal. And that actually matters more than I think I can stress, because once you accept that, certain political realities follow. And it's a very powerful statement. I think probably the most powerful sentence ever written. And we can all point to it and say, because this is true, I have rights. And because I have rights, you can't do what you're planning on doing. And I think when you couple that with this idea of subsidiarity or whatever other word you might prefer to use to cover that, you get a very powerful political statement that is almost impossible to deny, right? The only way to deny it is to say, no, all people are not created equal. And if that's true, then slavery is possible. So which one is it? And I think once you start there, the rest of the dominoes fall.
So how do you determine what level things should be regulated at. I mean, I think we all agree that that it's an individual's decision what kind of socks to wear on a specific day, unless you're in the army or something. But yeah, so where do we draw the lines?
There's no clear bright line, right? Around the edges, things are going to be fuzzy, but there are certain touchstones you can look at. For example, if my actions impose a cost on my neighbor, that seems to call for some level of government action. Now, clearly, it doesn't require a federal action. It may not even require local. It could be simply something of a neighborhood getting together and saying, you stop doing that or whatever it is. If a town's activities, be it their manufacturing or consumption of something, imposes some cost, probably in the form of pollution, on the neighboring town, well, that might be a place in which the state needs to step in, but certainly not the federal government. And if you notice, and I'm using this example of pollution, but if you notice, this goes back to what I mentioned earlier of perhaps the one exception that might give credence to a world government is climate change. Because there you've got countries imposing costs on other countries, and something needs to be handled at a high level. So if you think about it in that sense of a person imposing some cost on another, what's the lowest level of government that can deal with that situation? Use that level of government.
Yeah, but here, the language again of the Declaration speaks volumes, right? Because in your example, Ant, if we're serious about climate change and we're going to impose some sort of restriction on sovereign states, they're going to say no, and they're going to say something like, we're only in the United Nations because we want to be. The consent of the governed has to matter. And if you start imposing these horrible costs on us, we will withdraw our consent. And I think if you take a look at right now, China and India, who are by all accounts the two biggest polluters on the planet, they're not going to sit and take that. They're not going to willingly say, okay, we do hereby give up our right to govern ourselves. And they're going to say something smart, which is going to be, well, you, the countries of the West, polluted for decades, if not centuries, and you got rich as a result. We're not rich. We could be if you got out of our business. And that's a very compelling argument, right? People who want to defend the climate in certain ways aren't going to care for it, but it's really quite powerful. And if you couple that with this idea that we have to consent to be governed in the first instance, we're not going to fix this problem.
But
United Nations are not.
Let's jump to the U.S. Constitution, because in the intro, when I spoke Danish, I told the listeners that the EU don't have, like, it's not possible there's no rule, there's no regulation that limits the power of the EU Commission and the EU politicians, as far as I understood from that article. But there's, in the US Constitution, there are strict rules to what the federal government can do. So can you tell us a little about that, James? What does it say in the Constitution?
Yeah, there's a couple of things that have proven to be interesting over the years. Probably the first is what we're looking at here. It's the Supremacy Clause, right? So if the federal government through Congress legislates, that law is to be understood as supreme over any state statute that exists. So we've got 50 member states, all of whom are diminished in some meaningful way because of the Supremacy Clause. There's also in Article 1, Section 8, which is the article in the Constitution that creates and defines Congress. There's a list of all the things that Congress can do. And theoretically, only those things can Congress do. And this was the chief limitation on the federal government once upon a time. Over the years, we've gotten away from that. Because at the end of the list of powers, there's this last clause, the necessary and proper clause. And this one says, if you're trying to accomplish something, Congress, if you must legislate and it's not in the list, if it's both necessary and proper, then you can go ahead and do it.
Okay, so there's an escape clause.
It is, and I've given you a very broad reading of it, right? We could parse words and get way down into the weeds, but this is, generally speaking, what it says and where we're coming from. And as a result of this and the Supremacy Clause, Congress has legislated more and more and more every year. They've created these bureaucratic agencies and situated them under the president in the executive branch. And before you know it, you have a gigantic federal government that can, in real terms, that can legislate about anything. And that's the death of subsidiarity or federalism.
And I think it gets even worse than what James is describing, because particularly over the past century, we have moved away from subsidiarity, away from federalism in this country. And one of the things we did was, correct me if I'm wrong, James, 17th Amendment, that when the country was originally founded, the people did not vote for the the people did not vote for the Senate. The senators were elected by the state legislatures. So Pennsylvania's state legislature would elect a couple of senators and send them to Washington. And that caused the Senate, one half of the Congress, it caused the Senate to be directly responsible to the states themselves, to the state governments. Now, we changed that with this, I think it was the 17th Amendment, and we said now senators will be elected by the people. And that went a long way to even further diminishing the states' abilities to restrain the federal government.
Yeah, okay,
right.
so I understand. Just come on, James.
It was the 17th Amendment, which was ratified in 1913, right at the height of the progressive era. Right? So the progressives take over, and before you know it, all kinds of new ideas are in the water.
So what I hear you say, Anthony, is that if you're in the Senate, you don't take power from the state government if they are the ones that basically gave you the job, because then you won't get the job again.
Yeah, exactly.
But now you have now you speak to the man on the street, basically. So it's, and if you don't care who regulates him, then. The man on the street cares that his senator is going to give him something. If it comes at the expense of his state government, he doesn't care.
Yeah, okay. And all of a sudden, we have a bicameral legislature, of course, with the House of Representatives and the Senate. And before you know it, senators and House members are reacting to more or less the same inputs. Right? Their inputs used to be radically different. The senators had to make sure that they treated the state as such, right? And now all of a sudden it's a little different, right? When they have to appeal not to the legislature but directly to the people.
Okay, that's interesting, because I wish I knew a little more about how EU is working, but at least some of the most important organs in the EU, they are directly elected from the member states. So we send a minister to meetings and so on. So that might be important.
Well, you have something in the EU that we do not have, that is, I would say, the ultimate check on power, which is you have established that it is possible for countries to withdraw. Mm-hmm. Now, we tried that, and it came to the conclusion that no, states may not withdraw, but that's the ultimate check on the power of the EU. Yeah, which we don't have in the United States.
And as different as the states are, and I do think they are very different here, the member states of the EU are more different still. Right? You've got different languages, different traditions. I mean, the member states of the EU are absolutely sovereign. If there's something that's happening that they don't like, they can leverage what they've got. And Ant is exactly correct. They've got the right of withdrawal at any point. And when that's the case, legislatures behave differently. They have to behave in such a way as, first, to retain the membership, which means everybody's going to have to agree. And in a condition like the EU, where you've got so many very different states with different heritage, that's going to be really hard. So what's going to happen? They're only going to legislate things at the broadest possible level. The further into the weeds they get, the less likely they are to maintain their grip on the states who have voluntarily joined.
So that might work even better than having a strict rule saying that the EU can only do this and that.
Well, when you write things down and you tell a group of politicians that this is the list of things you can do, they find a way around it real fast.
Yeah, so let's talk a little about that.
They're politicians, right? They lie, they cheat, and they steal. And let's never forget that. If you want to limit them, you better limit them in a structural way, not in a textual way.
So let's talk a little about that. But before we go into too many details, can you talk a little about, you started to talk about, is it Roe versus the ruling on abortion? Because I think a lot of people in, at least in Denmark and probably in most of the EU, thinks that it's whether abortion should be legal or illegal in the US. That's the question. But as far as I understand, that's not really the question. The question is who is to decide. Is that right?
This is very, very complicated. I can paint it in broad terms for you. The word abortion never appears, obviously, in the United States Constitution. There was no way it could, given when it was written. So you look at the Constitution, and Article 1, Section 8 lays out the powers of Congress, and nowhere in that list is the word abortion to be found. Sensibly. Okay. Is it necessary and proper to some other right that Congress can legislate on? And the answer to that is no as well, right? If you want to be honest about what's available here for the Supreme Court, the answer is nothing. And instead of laying out something from the text of the Constitution, they go in search of another right, the right to privacy, which is also not mentioned in the United States Constitution at all. Now, privacy seems to be one of those pre-political rights. You're just going to, like marriage, right? It exists long before the state, and it will outlive the state as well. So I think they're okay hanging their hat on privacy, but then they say in the text of the ruling that abortion equals privacy. And that's a leap of logic that no reasonable person would ever make. That's just stupid. And it's clear what they're trying to do, and I understand, but the way they actually did it makes no constitutional sense whatsoever. What would have becomes the good question. And we have in the 10th Amendment the perfect text for this, because the 10th Amendment ostensibly says anything that is not in the purview of the federal government is devolved to the states, which, given that the states are very powerful semi-sovereign outlets, well, that makes perfect sense. And yet the 10th Amendment never figures in to any of our constitutional jurisprudence. Why? Because an arm of the federal government, the Supreme Court in this case, would have to decide that the federal government does not have a power. And that's never going to happen. So there's your textual problem in the middle of the constitutional regime.
To underline what James is saying, prior to Roe v. Wade, given the 10th Amendment, the decision as to whether abortion was legal or illegal was up to the states. And you would have some states that would say yes and some states would say no. Roe v. Wade made it a blanket statement that it's legal across the board. So if Roe v. Wade were ever to be overturned, it would not make abortion illegal in the U.S. Rather, it would turn the decision over to the individual states. Now, some of the states might make it illegal within those states, but it would not be a blanket statement that is now illegal.
You see some states actually doing exactly what Anthony just said, right? We've got a couple of very conservative states that try to move on this every few years. It doesn't really work out, but this is the main reason why, when somebody's nominated to the Supreme Court in the United States, why the hearings are so vicious. Everybody wants to hear their answer to the question, what about Roe versus Wade? And I can tell you that every college student I've ever dealt with has been baptized in this fight over Roe versus Wade. I talk about it with them every time in every class. And yet you're left with this idiocy where a Supreme Court nominee will look into the camera and say, I have never thought about that case. I have no opinion. That is such an obvious lie that it doesn't pass the smell test. But in order for a conservative to get on the Supreme Court, that's the answer he has to give.
So no conservatives.
They dig their heels in on this nonsense every single time. And if it's true that every college freshman has seen the arguments, trust me, it's true that every Supreme Court nominee has seen it too. And yet the stakes are so high that they have to lie about what they think before they can even lay claim to a seat on the court.
And I think this is an interesting case because I think if you go out of my door and ask a random person if he think that the federal state in the United States should regulate and make it legal in all states in the United States, he would say, yes, I think that's fair because it's a human right. And if you ask, what if the federal state had the opposite view, that it should be illegal, then he would say, no, then it should be up to the to each member state to decide. So I think there's a lot of times, and we've seen that in that the EU just started to regulate paternal leave in the member states. So now both the mom and the dad has to have 9 weeks, I think it is, of paternal leave. So it can't all go to the woman. And when you hear people talk about it, they say that, okay, I think that in most cases the member states should decide on this, but since I agree on what the EU said, it's okay that they decide this. So what is your opinion on that kind of argument?
It's exactly what we see here year in and year out, right? People are fighting over political things. And if they think the easy win is at the federal level, that's where they're going to go every time. We have very little experience with the Supreme Court saying to the United States, no, this is not a federal issue. I think we'd be a lot healthier if we did, right? Because in the states, you do have a right of exit. I've lived in, I think, 6 or 7, maybe even 8 states by now. And the legislation in the various states is quite different. And where the rubber meets the road, where it's really important, is in tax rates. And if I can shop around and get a better deal in another state for taxes, why shouldn't I be allowed to do that? There was a time in our past where it didn't really matter, right? If you lived and worked in a place, you were going to stay there the rest of your life. You were going to keep that job for as long as you could. Well, things are rather different now, aren't they? In the wake of COVID, what have we learned? We've learned that we can move anywhere we want and still do our jobs, never walking into an office. My office, theoretically, is over 2,000 miles away. I never go there. All right, if that's true, then I should be looking at a lot of different states to find out where I can get the best deal. And the best deal takes taxes into account. It also takes quality of life into account, right? All these things.
Yeah.
And it's a brave new world that we're living in, right? We have jobs and we don't have to go to an office. Fantastic.
And that might be why you see now that that some people are arguing for minimum tax rate in EU on companies and so on, because they basically they want taxes on companies, and they can see this problem that companies can move around now.
Yeah, and that's an interesting thing because I had described that subsidiarity means governing at a low level, and you only raise the level if somebody is imposing a cost on somebody else far enough away that your current government can't handle it. And as I'm talking about that, I'm thinking about this push for global minimum corporate tax. And one way you might look at it is to say, well, if a corporation can leave the United States for Mexico, for example, because the taxes are lower in Mexico, well, that's imposing a cost on the United States government. The only way you can make that argument is if you admit that the profits the company makes belong to the United States government. That is, if I'm a company and I leave and I take my tax revenue with me, I'm not imposing a cost on you if the money belongs to me. It's only if the money actually belongs to you. So what's actually happening here is we talk about countries coming together and signing on to this minimum global tax. This is not an application of subsidiarity. This is the creation of a cartel. It's what in this country, I'm sure in the EU as well, is illegal. It's called price fixing. When the big companies get together and they agree, okay, we're going to bilk the customer for this much money and nobody go below this, right? That's illegal. And yet that's exactly what the country's governments are arguing.
Well, it's never a problem when the government does it, right? This is the underlying thought to everybody who wants the pervasive state to exist, right? They want the state to exist, to reach into their lives, and more importantly, into all of their neighbors' lives, to regulate every damn thing. And we're about there now. I do this thought experiment with people when I speak in person. And I say, look, I want you to think very hard, and I want you to tell me how you're free. I'm not asking how free are you. I'm asking how you're free, which means I want to know how much do you do in the course of an average day that's not regulated by your government. And the answer to that question is almost nothing. Almost everything is regulated by the government, especially when you take into account the different levels of government that we have, right? So the mattress I sleep on is regulated. The coffee maker I use in the morning is regulated. And you can go through the steps of your average day and see that everything you do, everything you use is regulated. The only thing here in this country that is not regulated as such is your thought. You're allowed to think what you will think. Now, if you act on that thought, that's going to be regulated. And that's where we stand. And you know, the nanny state as it exists doesn't leave you alone at any minute of the day.
And that's not entirely true, is it? Because sometimes what you think also matters. If you go out and
if I commit a crime, they're going to ask what was on my mind when I committed that crime. It's the principle of mens rea, and there you go, right? So yeah, I have the ability to think as long as I don't act on it or even tell anyone what I'm thinking, which really isn't enough if you think it through, right? That we're not living in a free society if what I said is true and what I said is absolutely true.
So let's take a few other examples, because I remember hearing you talk about, I think it was a farmer who was growing grain to feed to his pigs or something. And oh, you're nodding. So can you tell that?
Wickard V Filburn. Yeah.
Can you tell us about that?
Yeah,
James, you know that better than I do.
Yeah, slightly is my guess. It's a case where a grown man who was a farmer, and his farm existed inside of a state. It wasn't over a state border or anything like that. And he wanted to grow wheat, I think it was, in order to feed his own cattle. So here was a man who was not involved in interstate commerce, who had some cattle on his land, who wanted to grow the food himself for the cattle. And this ran afoul of a federal statute, which limited how much you could grow. And he said, well, you know, it's not like I'm bringing it to market. I'm just feeding the animals. And the Supreme Court said, not so fast, buddy. What we're going to do here is tell you that you're wrong, that you can't grow food for your own cattle on your own land that would never go to market. Because if you didn't, you would have been buying that food for your animals. And because you didn't buy that food for your animals, interstate commerce was impacted negatively. Therefore, we can rule over you right now and tell you that you are not permitted to grow food for your own cattle. Which, if you just sit and think about that for 1 second, is the dumbest thing you've ever heard, right? This doesn't pass the laugh test in any way, shape, or form. And yet this became the governing principle in the United States from that day forward. So from the 1930s up to yesterday, this is what you've got to deal with. This is what the Supreme Court can do if it chooses. And that case, that's just legislating from the bench, and it's terrible legislating. It's not even good at what it is. And if that's permissible, if the Supreme Court can get away with that form of judicial murder, then everything else is possible too. Because how many things in the world could be as ridiculous as that case?
And
that case is so obvious what the right decision was there. Leave the farmer alone. He's on his own land, feeding his own cattle. That's the right answer. Any reasonable person would know this. And yet the Supreme Court found a way to go the other way.
Notice what happened here. This case was back in the 1930s, and the Supreme Court had decided what it wanted the answer to be. It wanted the answer to be that, yes, the federal government can regulate this guy. And so it went through these mental gymnastics to argue why actually this law that attempts to regulate this guy is indeed constitutional. That was the first. And then there was a whole series of these over the subsequent, whatever it is, 90 years of the Supreme Court just deciding that it knows what answer it wants and making mental gymnastic arguments to argue that whatever it is that the federal government wants to do is indeed constitutional. And when you do things like that, two things are happening. One is you're starting the argument from the outcome. Rather than asking the question, what is and is not constitutional? You're asking the question, what do I want? And now I'm going to shoehorn it into the Constitution as I like. So that's one thing that you do. It makes the Constitution ineffectual in a lot of ways. The other thing that happens is it makes the appointments to the Supreme Court much, much more important. And this is why in this country, I believe, our presidential elections have become so divisive, because it's the president that appoints to the Supreme Court. And so if you've got a president who's of your party, you're likely to get Supreme Court nominees who are in line with your party. And why is that so important? It's so important because the Supreme Court no longer considers what does the Constitution say. They simply argue that whatever it is they want is indeed constitutional. And so in a lot of ways, we have ceased to be a country governed by a constitution. We have become a country governed ultimately by this panel of 9 human beings.
The black robes govern us all. And it's a little more pernicious, Anthony, than you just laid out, because if you think through what Anthony just said, and I think it's all exactly right, it explains why you get these awful people running for the presidency who win. And I'm obviously thinking of Donald Trump here. Most Republicans looked at Donald Trump and said, this is not a good person. I don't want to vote for him. But when he became the nominee because there were so many people running for the office, right? If 8 of them had dropped out, he wouldn't have been anywhere near the nominee. But he was able to split the vote and got the nomination. Most Republicans looked at that and said, look, I don't like him. This is a bad person. But do I really want Hillary Clinton nominating the next Supreme Court justices? And oh, God, no, is what they all said. And I think rightfully so in a lot of ways, right? And this is why you end up with a character like Trump in the White House, which from an external perspective, most foreigners that I knew who they were on the phone with me the next day asking how this could possibly have happened.
Yeah, it's
incomprehensible.
Most people in Denmark before the election were asking themselves why. I mean, how can you end up with 2 candidates like that?
They're this bad.
We were asking that question as Americans.
Yeah, but we were.
But let's get back to the topic, because going into this conversation, I was nervous about how the EU was going to evolve in the future, and thinking that we don't have legislation that limits the power of EU. But after talking to you for 30 minutes now, I think we're back to where that the only thing that matters is incentives. So what text you write doesn't matter if the incentives are not aligned with the text, and if the federal government wants the power, which politicians normally want, then they're going to grab it sooner or later. So maybe the EU is actually working a little better because, as you already mentioned, we have the possibility to exit. And maybe if we want a better society, then that's what we should promote, like the ability to leave and other parts of the incentive scheme that makes the EU work in a way that works together with this principle of subsidiarity.
Yeah, and you see that playing out here in the United States amongst the states. You have the ability to walk away from a state. Right now, California is bleeding residents and businesses because of decades of horrible policies and horrible taxes. People are just leaving. They've said, we've had enough. And that's going to force California to change the way it does its business.
And we can monitor this, actually. It's very interesting. If you take a look, not at the people who are coming and going, but at the trucks that they rent to come and to go, U-Hauls and things like this in the U.S., what you find is that it's very, very expensive to rent a truck to go from California to another place. But it's almost free to rent a truck going from anywhere into California, because they have to get those trucks back so more people can move out of the state. And you know, when we talk about the right to exit, this has real world ramifications, right? Because who's leaving California? And it's people who make a pretty nice living, right? People who are going to be taxed completely. They're the ones leaving. And this is also true of the East Coast states, New York, Massachusetts. Those people are all leaving in droves too. And they tend to leave those places when they retire or when they make a lot of money. And all of a sudden the tax base just disappears. And what do you have to do? Connecticut, my home state, they just keep raising the tax, thinking that there will be a level at some point where we can cover our losses. But there isn't, because every time they raise the tax, more people leave. Incentives matter to both the government and the people.
But I think that's the part where EUs are very different from the United States, because people in EU don't, I mean, they stay in the country they are in.
Sure.
And also you can't, I mean, you can leave the state, but you can't easily leave the United States, because then things become a little more complicated. Of course, you have Canada, but as soon as you get out, there's most countries that don't speak English. So I think I think that maybe one policy you should have on the shelf, just if the opportunity comes, then you should have it, is to give this power to leave to lower what's called like stages of the government. So say that okay, so in the US you should allow the states to leave, and within the states you should maybe allow the counties to leave,
right?
A group of counties to leave, and maybe in Denmark we should make it possible for a group of municipalities to leave and form a new country, just to make sure that they won't be forced into something that they don't really want.
And that's
there. The incentive there is perfect, right? Because now the political subdivisions, they have to appeal to the individuals. They have to say to them, look, we know that government is hard and we know that it might cost you something, but we're going to do the absolute best job we can do for you. And it's one thing to have the right to vote them out of office. It's quite another if you have the right to vote them out of office and you can leave. And as long as that second thing with the two sides of the coin, if that's the case, you're going to get fantastic governance, because the people who govern are going to be terrified that people will just bail.
Yeah. The only problem with the idea is that it's never going to happen, because they won't give you that power back.
Yeah, exactly. But if you think about it, we're talking about politics here, but it becomes very familiar to people when you point out that this is exactly how it works in the marketplace. If I'm going to a store and the store is not providing me with the services I want at prices I'm willing to pay, I go to a different store, and it forces this store either to figure out what is done wrong and do it better so I come back, or to close down and have some other store take its place. So that ability to walk away that makes the marketplace so focused on consumers and satisfying what consumers want, subsidiarity brings that force to the political side also.
And so I don't think people think about it enough, right? I think that it's just a foreign concept when they think about their average day. But if I walk into a 7-Eleven, a convenience store, and I want Coke, and they have only Pepsi, I said, well, there's going to be another convenience store real soon. I just go to the next one. But if I'm in an airport and I go to get a Coke and all they have is Pepsi, that's a contract for the entire airport. I'm screwed. There's no way I can get what I want.
Yeah.
Right. So now my choice is, do I get what I don't want or do I get nothing? And that's almost always the political choice. Do I get what I don't want or do I get nothing? And if we can stay away from that, right? And here you have to say, well, politics should be a touch more like markets, but we don't really mean that. Not really. The politics, we don't want them to be like markets in the end, because markets don't take the individual into account at every moment, right? And politics has to. So we want them to be more like markets, but not completely like markets. And I think that's a message that almost nobody ever gets.
But still, in your airport example, there's if one thing is that you can't get a Coke, but if the airport is really terrible, that you can only, if you can't get a plane, but you can only get a bus, basically, then you can always move to another place where the airport is better, or you can drive to another airport. So there's a limit to how bad the airport can be and how bad the government can be if you can leave, if it's too bad.
If you can leave, right.
We saw the United Kingdom that it wasn't an easy Brexit at all, and we don't know yet if it was a good idea for them. But at least they had the choice. So if they thought that EU was getting too bad, then they could leave.
And notice something. Notice something as well. Let's suppose, for the sake of argument, and of course we don't know yet, but let's suppose for the sake of argument it was good for the people of UK. What's interesting is it's also good for the people who remained in the EU, because the fact that the UK exited means now that the EU's government is going to be much more attentive to what its member countries want, for fear of another one doing that.
Or they're going to make it even more difficult to leave.
Or alternatively, they make it more difficult to leave. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But at least we can
either
see
way,
now.
we're going to know. Either way, we're going to know exactly what we're looking at the next year or two.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's. I think in the United Kingdom, the good thing is that they showed us that it's possible, because before they did it, everybody was. Nobody really knew what was going to happen when you left the EU, but now they show that, okay, things probably aren't perfect, but they probably don't die, all of them. So it's possible if we think EU gets too bad. So I think my last question was how you think that EU will evolve in the future. But I think maybe we already discussed that, because we can leave if it gets too bad, and that's probably going to put a limit on what EU is going to put down on us.
Yeah, that's my argument, although you made a very good counter argument, which is that, or alternatively, the EU just makes it more difficult to leave.
Yeah, but at least
knowing politicians, they're going to go for that latter option before they go for the former.
Yeah, but now we know, and we know what to fight. So
right, yes, yeah. You know what to fight. Yes.
And from an external perspective, from the perspective of an American who goes to Europe from time to time, I always worry that what's going to be lost is the distinctive character of various countries. Right? They're all going to just start looking like each other. It's going to be homogenized over time, and that may be the best thing, economically speaking. I don't know one way or the other. I know that the trend is towards that, no matter where you look. So it's probably the best thing economically for the various constituent states. But something is very likely to be lost, something important, something beautiful. And that's the difference between one place and another. So I hope, they find a way to maintain that, even as they become more economically linked through the currency and through trade over time.
Yeah, me too, because the difference is important for development, basically, like for innovation.
Yeah. And I've never been to Denmark, and it would bother me till no end if I said, well, I've never been to Denmark, and a bunch of Danes said, well, you've been to Holland, it's the same thing. I think there's something so essential that's lost when that happens, that I don't know what to say about it. The culture of the West has become very homogenized, right? I can go to any country and order a Big Mac and get exactly what I'd get in any other country. And I don't want that not to be the case. If people want Big Macs, go nuts and go get one. But I would like to always know that if I'm going to a country I've never been to, if I'm getting on a plane and going to Sweden, I'd like to know that there's a good reason for me to go there. And I worry that that's not going to be the case years from now.
Yeah, but I think that's more connected to the thing that people just travel around the whole world and they hook up on Zoom like we do here. So and goods and services moves around the planet. So probably 200 years ago, things were very different from in Copenhagen and other major cities in Denmark. But now they're more or less the same. So and that's probably going to happen between countries too. So.
Yeah, probably.
But you'll probably be gone before it's all
well,
exactly
here's
the
to
same.
hope I live long enough to see it. But it's just one of those things, right, that you look at and you say, well, that's going to be too bad when it happens. But like you, I think it's probably going to happen because I see it already happening. So we'll see where it all goes.
I heard you a lot of times say that if there's one time that you want to, that you prefer to be born, it's now or in the future.
That's right.
So
I like everything that's happening right now.
Yeah,
where
it's cost and benefits to everything.
Right.
Yeah,
right.
I mean, look at the miracle of my life, right? And the two of you would say something not unlike this. I'm sitting here in a house that's temperature controlled. Water comes right into the house. All I have to do is turn a knob, and there it is. I've got a thing in the kitchen that heats everything. It's one miracle after another. Right? Even my grandparents could never have imagined this. It's not like we have to go back 300 years. No. My grandparents, who all lived for me to meet, they could never have comprehended what I live with right now. And that's fantastic. My children, fantastic. I hope my children can say the exact same thing when they're my age.
James and Anthony, thank you so much for making me a little more comfort about the future in the European Union. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. Thanks for having us, Jonas.
The pleasure was all ours. Thank you so much.